Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second chapter in our Humanities class. Last week we studied the beginnings of the origins of religion. We saw this in Mesopotamia. We looked at the Epic of Gilgamesh. We went into Egypt, Egyptian religion and Egyptian culture. We saw how karma and dharma and the Atman and the Brahman work in and achieving the state of nirvana in in India, and we also saw ancestor worship and how that operated, and also working within nature in Taoism. We began the last chapter looking at animism and shamanism also. We will be returning to religion here with the Greeks as we look at the Greek gods. And then in chapter 4, we will see modern religions forming in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So we're going to first go through the Greeks through our chapter, and then you have a reading assignment. The assessment makes sure that you are complete in answering your assignments and that they are coming from the textbook, The Landmarks of the Humanities by Gloria K. Fierro. You'll have a discussion assignment, which will be Plato's Allegory of a Cave, and we will see a short animation that has Orson Welles as the narrator teaching us what it is to see shadows rather than to see reality in a cave. So let's start our journey. Let me get back to the beginning of this here. All right, let's start with a map of the Aegean and who are the Greeks. So we're going to look at the Greeks in three different sections, four different sections. The Minoans, the Mycenaeans, the great warrior mythical group from Peloponnesia, who are the ones of the Trojan War fame. And the Trojan War and the Iliad and the Odyssey will become the great epic poems that describe Greek culture, disseminate Greek language also at the same time. And then we will get into, after the two wars with the Persians, we will look at the city-state of Athens and what is known as classical Greece. So we use the term classical for two different ways. We talk about classicism being the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans around 450 BC to the end of Rome around 470 AD. But when we talk about the Greeks, we have the Minoans from Crete, the earliest great civilization, the Mycenaeans from Peloponnesia, then we have the city-state of Athens, and then we will have Hellenization from Alexander the Great of Macedonia, who will then create an empire that will expand off the map here into present-day Turkey and Persia or Iran, and into parts of India and also northern Africa. The world will become Hellenized, and we will find Greek theaters, Greek building, Greek culture, Greek philosophy spread around the known world. But to understand what it is to be Greek is to understand that these are seafaring people in the Aegean Sea, and that they are traders. They are trading in Lebanon. They are trading with Egypt. They are trading in North Africa. And also they are building cities in North Africa. Alexandria will be built in Egypt and is named after Alexander. And again, will become a kind of great city in its own right that is built as a kind of uniquely Greek city on top of the history that we've already studied from Egypt. So to be Greek is to be part of the Cyclades, to be from Crete, to be Peloponnesian, to be on the Greek mainland continent. All of this is Greek. and they share a common history, they share a common language, and they are also trading and also going to war with each other. So the Greeks are the foundation of classicism that are laid out during the Bronze Age. And as we looked at in our last chapter, the Bronze Age is that age of from around, around 3000 BC, with metallurgy, use of copper and tin to make bronze weapons, to make this bronze statue that we're looking at here, and will be replaced around 1000 BC with the Iron Age, a stronger metal that also does not require trading to be able to make the metal. Copper and tin were not in any one country, so to make bronze, you had to trade to make it. Iron ore can basically be found anywhere. So starting with the Cyclades. So when we look at the ancient Aegean civilizations from around 3000 to 1200 BC, the Bronze Age, we have the great culture of the Minoans, and we also have the Cyclades. And again, this notion of being Greek, and to be Greek is profoundly influenced by Hellenic notions like reason and beauty and the good life. These all bear stamps on the Greek society. The Cyclades were a group of kind of circular formed islands between Greece and Turkey. We don't know a lot about them, but we do find evidence of settlements as early as 5000 BC, and we have found evidence of art that they made, these small marble figurines here, that you can find at the Getty Malibu in Los Angeles. In fact, I think they have this specific one here. We don't know much about them because they were put on the black market and they were sold when archaeology had very kind of shady practices. If you've ever seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, you kind of know what I'm hinting at here. So we don't know exactly where from the Cyclades these came. We don't know what strata of soil that they came from. We simply know that they are from the area. And they have similar features. They look very modern in terms of geometry. They are human, but faceless. They don't have a dramatic kind of anatomy. But what you do see here is that it's female. There's a triangular vulvic symbol here. We know that these are knees. They look closer maybe to the Venus of Willendorf than they will look like the Greek classical sculptures of the 400s and the classical age of the Greeks. The Minoans. So the Minoans were on the island of Crete. They had a very great, successful society that, by the way, is documented really well in this documentary, Cavemen to Kings. There are 3 episodes of this, and I have I believe the first or the second one here, episode 1. And it does a really good job of explaining how important the Minoans and the Mycenaeans were. Very often we only talk about classical and the Alexandrian age of Hellenism. But here we see a very thriving community, an artistic community. They are trading. They're doing really well. And probably around 1400 BC, their civilization is either absorbed or destroyed by the Mycenaeans. They were thought to be legendary until we have a discovery of Knossos, the legendary castle of the Minoans and King Minos. So this ultimate kind of three-story palace here was a labyrinth of masonry, dozens of rooms and corridors around a central courtyard, and it was probably mostly about ceremonial processions and other aspects of Cretan life, and also famous for some of their frescoes. One of the fresco which has been restored here is the Leaping Bull fresco. So we believe that this is a kind of sport where you vault over the bull. So when you get the bull to charge, you grab its horns and you flip over the bull unscathed. We also know that they had a writing system called Linear A and Linear B, but I believe both of these have not been deciphered yet. So the rediscovery of Knossos is from Arthur Evans, and again, probably some kind of shoddy archaeological and restoration processes here. Another thing that we find in the Minoan archaeological sites from around 1600 BC is this priestess who, I believe in the restoration, they added the arms with the snakes. So we often call it the snake goddess, but that is something that was added on later and might not be necessarily true. One of the great legends of Knossos is the Minotaur, the half bull, half man, that was born in a union with Minos' queen and a sacred white bull. According to this story that comes much later, a clever Athenian hero, Theseus, is aided by the king's daughter, Arande, and they make their way through the Minotaur's labyrinth and kill the monster, which frees Athens from its ancient bondage to the Minoans. So this is kind of an origin myth that more than likely doesn't have much truth to it directly. The next great civilization are the Mycenaeans from around 1600 to 1200 BC. They are militant, they are aggressive, they are challenging through their warships traders for control of the eastern Mediterranean, and their city is really famous for how massive the walls are, and in fact so massive that it was believed later that they were built by a mythical race of giants known as the Cyclops. So we have found beehive-shaped tombs, we've found weapons and jewelry, and also we know a bit about Agamemnon, who is the legendary king who will be involved in the Great Trojan War. So the Trojan War is kind of part about what it is to be Greek. So in the Trojan War, from around around 1200, we believe that the Mycenaeans attack Troy and the commercial stronghold on the northwest coast of Asia Minor, where Turkey is, and it's a 10-year war between the Mycenae and the Trojans. That is the context for the Iliad. So being Greek is being involved in this war, speaking the language, and here we're seeing a map of Homer, the writer, the legendary blind poet who writes the Iliad and the Odyssey, and we're getting an idea of what Greek society is from the second book, the Odyssey, starring Odysseus, who is one of the heroes of the Iliad. He is trying to get back home to his wife. The gods are against him, and he is blown off course. And we believe that this is the course that he takes ultimately to get back home. And again, this story gives us this idea of, it's kind of like a travelogue, which gives us an idea of what the expanse of these seafaring people were in the Aegean and in the Mediterranean. So the war around 1200 BC, we have the Trojans. The Trojans are around here in the Aegean. They are ultimately going to lose the war, and much of what we know about the Trojans is about the writing that comes approximately 400 years later describing the war. So the war had been an oral tale, that is not written down till 400 years later. Troy is well fortified, and the gods, the Greek gods, are all involved in this war and meddling at every turn. And sometimes some of them are on the side of the Trojan for various selfish reasons, and other gods are on the side of the Greeks. So this history that we get from Homer is not a history as we know it. This is a history that everything has some relationship to the Greek gods. And we'll get to the Greek gods in a moment. So in the heroic age, from 1200 to 750 BC, we have a powerful iron-bearing tribes, the Dorians, Greek-speaking people from the north, who will destroy the Mycenaean civilization. During a long period of political and social turmoil, the storytellers are keeping alive the story of the Great Trojan War, ultimately written down somewhere maybe around 800 BC by Homer. Now, Homer probably is not a singular person, but probably an organization or a group of poets who agree to write down the parts that they know about the Trojan War and the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then combine them together. It seems highly unlikely that a blind poet would be able to write this down, certainly without a scribe doing it for him. So I think the idea that it's a blind poet is kind of the group winking at us and letting us know that it's not a singular person, but more of a group of people. So in the Iliad takes place in the last days of the Trojan War. The hero is Achilles, who is moved to anger and is petty, even though he's a great warrior. He can take out hundreds. And he decides that he is not going to join the war because of a slight that he feels. And his best friend, perhaps lover, Patroclus, is going to, of course, be in the war. And when he dies, Achilles is going to be filled with such grief and rage that he is going to kill the person that killed his friend, Hector. And he's so mad that rather than killing Hector and then moving on and honoring Hector as a warrior, he is going to drag his naked body around the walls of Troy until finally they agree to a temporary truce. So part of what you get in Greek stories is the idea that even the most powerful and brilliant people still have failings often morally. And in fact, you never really want to be like a Greek god, as opposed to, say, the monoethical God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This God is a perfect being in morality and ethics, and you're striving to be like them. With the Greeks, you don't want to be like the gods. They're petty, they are selfish, and yet they are very powerful and can cause great destruction, even though they have these really human parts to them. And I think we find the same thing as a lesson kind of with Achilles as well. The second book is the Odyssey. So the Odyssey is the journey back home taken by Odysseus, the clever and resourceful hero of the Trojan War. He is trying to reassert his authority as the king of Ithaca. Much like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Iliad and the Odyssey belongs to the dynamic history of rugged young culture. But in the Epic of Gilgamesh, we find that the theme is the pursuit of everlasting life. The Greek epic deals with the quest for individual honor and glory. So the Iliad is a robust tale of war, but its true subject is Achilles. And with Achilles, he is the personification of youthful bravery, a superhero, but he is psychologically complex, more so than Gilgamesh is. He is exhibiting anger, love, rage, and grief. He is totally human in his pettiness. Odysseus is going to fall in favor with a few gods, fall out of favor with other gods, and ultimately be blown off course and have all these amazing journeys. One of the most famous that is illustrated here is him and his men are going to be taken captive by a giant cyclops. Ultimately, the cyclops is going to get drunk and blinded, and then the men are going to get out of the sealed cave under the bellies of the giant sheep. Then Odysseus finally is going to get back home. He is going to find that his wife has many suitors, and he is going to arrive disguised as a beggar, enduring abuse and insult from the suitors, and then ultimately he will reveal himself and reunite with his loving wife Penelope. So, Greek gods in Homer. The Greek gods are personalizing every aspect of the Greek world, both natural and cultural, and their experiences in it. The earth, the sea, the mountains, the rivers, custom law, and one's share in society are all seen as personal as well as naturalistic terms. The gods prefer peace on Olympus to helping their worshippers. And no matter how well you worship one of these gods, they will still turn on you at any given time. It is believed that Zeus, the strongest of the gods, had favored the Trojans in the Great War, while Hera, the goddess of marriage, had favored the Greeks. So even though the strongest god was on the side of the Trojans, they still fell. Now, the history of the Greek gods and the principal Greek gods, so there are kind of a few phases of Greek god history. And we find these in the Greek writer Hesiod, that in the beginning there were these primordial gods and chaos, and ultimately chaos is going to turn the abyss into a personification of the world through the goddess Gaia. And then there will be 12 titans, 6 male, 6 female, Cronus, and the youngest one being Cronus or Time. Gaius did not like how Uranus treated her children. She becomes furious with Uranus and decides to take revenge. She asks her other children, the Titans, to cut Uranus's genitals and overthrow him. From the drops of his blood that fell on Gaia, the Furies and the Giants and the Titans are born. The next state of gods are the Olympian gods, the Greek gods that we would find in Athens. So we find the personification of Zeus, his wife Hera. You'll notice 6 men, 6 women. The Greek gods are always about procreation. The god of water, Poseidon. We have Athena, the god of wisdom and war. We have Aphrodite, the god of love and beauty. Artemis, the god of the hunt and wild animals. And they are all able to change themselves. Poseidon is the god of the sea. Zeus is the god of the sky, throwing lightning bolts whenever he needs to. And also Apollo is the god of light, medicine, and music. And that'll be important, I think, when we are studying art. So we learn about these gods from Hesiod and his Theogony. This is where we get an idea of who the gods are, how they behave, and what their histories are. Also, the Greeks also are worshiping the gods in various forms, and we find many temples dedicated to specific gods. And we also have a Delphi. At Delphi, we have a place for divining the future. So, according to legend, Zeus sent 2 eagles, and they cross over Delphi where the navel of Gaia was found. It is known as kind of the navel or the belly button of the world. Apollo will slay a python, a dragon, that was protecting the navel of the earth. And then as that dragon is rotting, the fumes from the dragon are something that priestesses will, a Sibyl will smell the gases, fall into a trance. Apollo will possess her spirit, and while she's raving, she is predicting future events. And so the Delphic oracle has a lot of influence, and leaders and generals are not making major excursions without consulting the oracles. So the Greek city-states and the Persian Wars. So the Persian Wars begin in 490. There is a Greek force of 11,000 men that meets the Persian army, twice as many numbers as the Greeks, and defeat them, only losing 192 men. Persian casualties exceed 6,000. Legend has it that the Greek herald who brought the news of victory at Marathon to Athens died upon completing a 26-mile run, where the term marathon comes from. In the Second War, the Persians build a fleet of warships, and in 480, they are ultimately defeated defeated the Persian armada at Salamis in one of the final battles of the Persian War. The golden age of the Greeks is going to come after the Second Persian War, and the Second Persian War and these Persian Wars. After the Second Persian War, all the Greek states are going to come together to defeat the Persians, and a golden age from 480 BC to 430 BC is going to emerge. After the Great Persian War, the Greek states are going to form the Delian League, and they are going to pool their money and resources to make sure that they can finance any future wars that they will need. And that's going to cause ultimately a war called the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens, because Sparta is kind of upset how much money that the Athenians are spending on the treasury known as the Parthenon. And we know something about the Peloponnesian War from history that is writing history in a very modern way without Greek gods in it. Maybe the very first kind of modern history tells us about the Peloponnesian War. And the Peloponnesian War is also in Greek literature like Lysistrata, where the women between the Spartans and the Athenians get together and decide that they will withhold sex until the men decide that they will stop fighting. Great kind of story. In the great classical age, we know about Pericles and the funeral oration, and that he is praising the dead from the wars against the Persians, and that he is announcing that Athens, the Athenians, is a school of the Hellas, and he says, I doubt if the world can produce a man where he only has himself to depend on, is equal to so many emergencies and graced by so happy a versatility as the Athenians. So he is kind of announcing this great Greek classical age that is beginning. And again, the age of the Delian League. Greek government. So Greek government is based on a polis. And the polis is run by Greek citizens. The Athenian Greek polis is a way of governing in a kind of democracy. And we know about this democracy because it's written about by from Plato called the Republic. And this is where we get the word polis, that the best form of government is one that leads to the common good for everybody. Later on, Aristotle will go so far as to say that it is a middle class who is best suited to rule, because wealthy people have an agenda, poor people have an agenda, but middle class people are more likely to be in it for common good. Now, this government is on the surface very democratic, but only run by people who are male and also own land. There are slaves, there are out of state workers and women. They ultimately have no power in the government. What Plato believes is that there are 5 economic classes and 4 virtues. The economic classes are producers, merchants, sailors, ship owners, retail traders, and wage earners. And the virtues of a just, good city include wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. And the Greeks are all about moderation and a middle path. You should never be a bully, but you should never be a coward. You should have courage. We know about Athenian democracy also, where it begins from Solon and also Cleisthenes, that we have this new way of getting rid of wealthy people and kind of kings in favor of a democracy that ensures a type of equality, and that also by having citizens there maybe is less corruption, possibly, even though I think it still probably exists. Now, non-citizens and Athenian women, they don't have it quite as good. Athenian women, although we find them heralded as goddesses, we find them as heroes in Greek literature, we find writers in poetry like Sappho's. We do not see women involved in government, and in fact, mostly housewives are kept in seclusion, not allowed to mingle with men in any setting. There was a saying by Greek women that it was better to be invisible than have anybody say anything about you. Now, kind of cultures that are happening in Athens. So we have the Olympic Games. The Olympic Games, or the All-Greek Pan-Hellenic Festival, is instituted in 776 BC in honor of the Greek gods. Located in Olympia, one of the religious centers in Greece, the festival takes place every 4 years, even during wartime. Truces were guaranteed for these games. Women are not allowed to participate, and prowess rather than cunning is valued in all games. Wrestling, hair pulling, and finger bending are permitted, but biting and finger breaking are forbidden. The match is terminated when either wrestler gave up, lost consciousness, or fell dead. And then also the Olympics, the major event in the Olympics is a 1,000-yard dash. The men are competing nude, and the Greeks love male youth. They love the muscular body. And we see this, say, in their art. Here, we're looking at some Greek ceramics from the classical age, where we know this as the red style. And you'll notice in the pottery, the figures are elongated, their muscularity is not necessarily totally realistic and stylized, and it is in remarkable contrast versus Greek sculpture from the era that we'll be looking at in a little bit. Another great part of Greek culture is Greek theater. In Athens, theatrical performances are happening twice annually. We have masters of drama. We have writing by Aristotle in how theater and drama is supposed to operate. And Greek theater is growing out of these complex rituals associated with the worship of Dionysus, the god of wine and vegetation and seasonal regeneration. In other words, we farmed, now we've harvested, let's party a little bit. And let's consider what it is to be Greek. So the advent of theater begins with the poet Thespis at 534 BC. The actor and the chorus, the performers, seem to become separated from those who simply are viewing the action, the audience. Initially, the chorus would have been the audience itself, but these are going to become professional actors. We also have Greek comedies that are developing out of reveling, celebration, and seasonal rebirth. In these comedies, the early comedies before Aeschylus, the comics of Aristophanes, mostly are bawdy, a lot of penis, phallus jokes. And then in the second half of the 4th century, we get new comedy from Menander. And in his comedy, we are getting comedy that deals with private and family life, social tensions, and the triumph of love in various contexts. And we are looking at theater that has masks, that will have sets that are built, all creating this kind of really wonderful kind of setting. In the setting, we have these amphitheaters, and we see these amphitheaters all over the Hellenized world as well. And in the theater Epidaurus, we see a theater that was designed by Polykleitos the Younger. Polykleitos is the sculptor who creates the classical Greek sculptures of realistic-looking anatomy. We have a theater that is built specifically for acoustics and can have thousands of spectators. The double amphitheater is what modern sports stadiums are based on. Satyr plays are also part of the Greek theater world. These are the tragi-comedy, bawdy satires, and burlesque, the half-goat, half-men, who are kind of bawdy, kind of naughty, kind of silly a little bit. And every single cycle of play would include satyr plays, dramas, and comedies. And there would be a contest that would announce who the winning playwrights would be. And there are a number of playwrights, but only 44 plays have survived by 4 playwrights. So we are limited in what we know, but we are pretty convinced that these playwrights were very important. These were not minor playwrights. And probably their plays had been rewritten past antiquity to survive into today. So Aristophanes was the comic playwright. 11 of his 30 plays survive. His old comedy is broad characteristics, topicality, festivity, complexity, and he also contributes to dramatic structure in his plays. But it is his poetic rhythms and meters that is kind of the greatness of the writing. And I think that's the greatness in writing generally, that you don't want to just read a summary of a great book. You want to read the book because the story is, of course, important, but it is the dialogue, it is the wittiness of the characters that ultimately make up the joy, I think, of reading anything in literature. Lyristrata is one of Aristophanes' maybe best known plays, and this is the play I talked about earlier, that women decide that they're sick of the Peloponnesian War and will not have sex with their men until they quit. Euripides was a tragedian of classic Athens. And in the Hellenistic age, he is a cornerstone of literary education along with Homer's Demosthenes and Menander. He is known for the Bacchae, concerned with the two opposite sides of men's nature, the rational and civilized side, and then also the instinctive side, represented by Dionysus, the god of wine, in his drunkenness. Medea is one of the best known plays by Euripides. It is about a jilted wife who her desire for revenge is going to bring down the house, but also shows that the disadvantages that exist for women in a patriarchal society. From the tragedies of Aeschylus, we get a second actor. The chorus has a principal role in his dramas, and one of his most important dramas is Prometheus Bound. Prometheus is a titan who decides that he wants mankind to survive, even though Zeus wants to kill off human beings. And he will bring humans fire, and he will also teach us writing, medicine, mathematics, astrology, metallurgy, architecture, and agriculture. And these things that are taught to us infuriates Zeus that we will possibly survive. And so he condemns Prometheus, the Titan, to be chained to a rock in perpetuity and to every day have his liver eaten out by a giant eagle. And then every night this liver will grow back and he will be tortured again. So Prometheus lives in eternal torture for helping us to survive. And the other great playwright is Sophocles, Antigone, and Oedipus. He is writing about the ancient king of Thebes, and in these tragedies, he's individualizing the characters for us. He's giving us moments of psychological intimacy as well. From Aristotle, we learn how a story is supposed to unravel. So you should have a plot, you should have conflict. The two types of conflicts would be an internal and an external conflict. The entire story should take place in one day. And then there are four basic parts to the plot: exposition, the basic situation, a conflict, a climax, and then ultimately a resolution. We have rising action and then falling action that closes the climax of the story. So the stories have very specific ways to be considered credible in Greek society in which they should be written. Greek poetry, of course, we know much about poetry from the epic poetry. We have lyrical poetry. We also have odes and hymns. Lyrical poetry should be accompanied by a lyre. We find this guitar-like lyre in ancient Mesopotamia, and is also implied that these poems also have musical accompaniment to them. One of the greatest of the lyrical poets is Sappho, from maybe 610 to 580 BC. We don't know a lot about her, but she led a group of women to the cult of Aphrodites. She trained women in the production of love poetry and music, and she also had homoerotic attachments to the women of Lesbos as well. So, poem in our textbook, I'll read just a couple lines for you. He is more than a hero, he is a god in my eyes, the man who is allowed to sit beside you, he, who listens intimately to the sweet murmur of your voice, the enticing laughter that makes my own heart beat fast. If I meet you suddenly, I can't. Speak, my tongue is broken. A thin flame runs under my skin, seeing nothing. And there goes on a little bit more, but that's just a little bit of kind of how that translates into English. Another very important aspect of the Greeks is their philosophy. Before the Greeks, we see writing in Mesopotamia and from the Egyptians, but mostly concerning gods. The Greeks are really interested in what is it to be human. The early Greek philosophers are known as the naturalists. They are interested in what is everything made of? What is permanent? What is the permanence of society? So, for example, Heraclitus is arguing that there is no permanence, but rather what reality is everything is in flux. From Thales, we get the idea that permanent elements include fire, water, and air, and flux is a basis of reality. Now, Heraclitus believed that the underlying form of Greek society permeates nature, the idea that resembles a Hindu pantheism, anticipating the Christian concept found in the Gospel of John of great intelligence governing the beginning of time, some sort of immortal force, impersonal, universal, and eternal. From Democritus, we get this belief that the invisible particle substance of the world is reality, and he calls these invisible bodies atoms. Pythagoras, I think, is also really important. He believes that both from material and non material views of the universe, he's departing from material and non material views of the universe. He believes that proportion and numbers are the true basis of reality. So he is going to come up with essential concepts in geometry. He's considered the father of pure mathematics. And he also discovers the relationship between musical harmonics and numbers. And again, gives us this sense that mathematical proportion is what creates beauty. Another form of philosophy is the sophists. And what the sophists are interested in is metaphysics. How do we know what we know? Can we be sure of anything that we know? And so they are exploring the mind, establishing the humanistic direction of Greek philosophy for about 2 centuries. So the sophists were concerned about defining the limits of human knowledge, and that knowledge could not exceed human opinion. Reality is incomprehensible, and so skepticism is a common form or a common trait in the sophists, and that they are also arguing that truth and justice are not absolute, they are absolutely relative. Socrates is a legendary Greek philosopher. Socrates is interested in not the clever arguments of the sophist, who are it's like a debate team where they can take any side and debate. He is interested rather in virtue, a condition of the psyche, and that to know good is to do good. He was a warrior in the Peloponnesian War, a stonemason by profession, and kind of a professional agitator. He creates the dialectical method of questions and answers. We also know him as creating the inductive reasoning method. So, in an inductive reasoning, you go from a specific to a general theory. Later on, from Aristotle, we're going to get deductive reasoning, where we go from general theories and then find specific ways to prove the theories. Ultimately, in his dialectics, he is exchanging ideas and uniting the citizens of the polis, but he also made many enemies, and ultimately he is sentenced to death for making the wrong people upset. He is sentenced to death, and And by the way, the only reason we know anything about him is his student Plato writes about him. Socrates, much like Christ, does not write anything himself. It was Christ's followers and people who believed in Christ and wanted to write down the stories and myths around Christ who wrote. Socrates is kind of the same way. In Plato's Crito, we find out that Socrates could maybe escape his punishment, but Plato tells us that Socrates believes that that would not be virtuous. He believes in the government, he believes in the polis, he has been, by law, he has been sentenced to death, and that for him to get out of his death, although it would be easier, that would be going against everything that he stood for. So from his student Plato, who probably is writing somewhere between 428 and 347 BC. He's born in Athens during the Peloponnesian War. He is benefiting from the golden era, along with the insecurities of the post-war era. And he is writing dozens of treatises, most of which are cast in the dialectic. In the Republic, he's asking questions like, what are the meaning of justice? What's the nature of a just society? He asserts the existence of a two-level reality, one consisting changing particulars to our senses, and the other is unchanging eternal truths understood by the intellect. He believes that all sensory objects are imitations of the pure forms that come from the mind, like the simplest mathematic equations that are imperishable and forever true. For example, the circle and the sphere exist independently of any particular circle or sphere. He also believes that in the forms, there is such a thing as universal forms like justice, love, and beauty, and that these things stand eternally and exist perfectly in the mind rather than in the physical world. In his allegory of a cave, we find this dualistic spirit and matter from prisoners who are chained to a wall and condemned to only see shadows of objects that pass by. Plato releases one of these prisoners, and they are able to turn and see that the reality that they thought was real is in fact simply an illusion, simply a shadow. And we begin to get this idea that perhaps that we all live in a world of our own shadows. And I think the cartoon that we're going to look at for our discussion, I think delves into this really, really well. Aristotle. So Aristotle is ultimately going to tutor Alexander the Great. Aristotle was a student of Plato, and Aristotle gives us the poetics that we looked at when we were looking at theater. He is creating the empirical method for science. In other words, you cannot be sure about anything unless you directly observe it. And this empirical method is a way of doing this. So he is using induction and the syllogism. The syllogism is a deductive scheme where he presents major and minor premise from which a conclusion may be drawn. So for example, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So from this kind of reasoning, we begin to kind of start to get into what will ultimately be the empirical method of the Enlightenment and the era of science that happens around that. He also writes about ethics, and he totally is all about this golden mean. The golden mean is living in moderation. Moderation is everything. Living in correct proportions. He talks about the eudaimonia, or the good life, And living a good life ultimately should be your goal, and fulfilling your function, whatever your function in life is. It's a very Taoist kind of idea. Finding that path, finding that river, and floating down it effortlessly is a Taoist idea. He also is writing about politics, and he also asserts that the best run government is a government run by the middle class. Art. So, when it comes to Greek art, much of it is very influential still today. So, the older styles, like the archaic pottery, we are seeing this before the classical age. So, we're looking at the Diplon master here from around 760 to 750 BC, working in Athens, and this is the black style of pottery. So when we get into the classical style, again, because of Pythagoras, proportion and order are very important. So we want humanism, we want the action of humans in our art. We want realistic art that is faithful to nature, and we also want to go beyond nature to an idealization and a perfection of humanism that surpasses nature. Well, we don't see that exactly in the early work here. In the early pottery, we instead are seeing very stylized forms that are painted on in black. We're looking at a funeral procession here. And then in the classical age, again, around the Persian Wars, we start to see the red style, where they are painting the black in the negative space, and then the red space is the red clay when it fires. And we are not getting maybe as exactly the exact human proportions and bodies that we'll see in sculpture, but we can see that they are definitely falling into something that is a little more humanistic, is a little more realistic, and again, still idealized at the same time. And a lot of Greek pottery is decorating Greek literature and Greek mythology for us. In sculpture, the archaic sculpture before the classical age, we have the kouros and the kore. So the kouros are boys, the kore are female. They have idealized faces and these really unique smiles to them that remind me also of Etruscan sculptures that we'll be seeing when we study the Romans. And so they're very Egyptian. If you remember Egyptian sculpture with the one foot in front of the other, the hands down at the side that we see from Pharaohic sculpture, again, the nude male, the female clothed, and not any one kind of person, but an overall idealization of the face, a face based on math, based on symmetry, based on proportions, the head broken into thirds, from the eyebrow to the top of the head, from the eyebrow to the bottom of the nose, from the bottom of the nose to the chin. All of this is in archaic sculpture that was usually used to decorate grave cemeteries. And this era is about 700 to 480 BC. In 480 BC, we get Polykleitos and his canon. So here we get the approach of realism and again idealism, humans being represented in various forms, often in an athletic state of contrapposto, where the weight of this young athlete is on one leg, the other leg is at rest, and then we are seeing an idealized face and a body that is perfected by math. The same thing kind of based on musical scales, where we find the proportions will base in Fibonacci numbers, for example. The first knuckle of the finger is 1, the second knuckle of the finger is 1. Together the two make up the third knuckle, 2. From the knuckle and the knuckles at the beginning of the hand to the wrist would be a length of 3 in the units. And then from 3 to 5 to the elbow, and then from 5 to 8 in the shoulder. And again, similar things happening in the legs as well. So when you look at a classical Greek sculpture, you're semi-obligated to count. It's about math. We also find in the classical age, too, nude female sculptures as well. So the clothed chore now has been changed into nude females, nude males, and again, the more naturalistic contrapposto style with the idealized face, no individuality. This is what classical sculpture is. Greek architecture. In classical Greek architecture, we get the Parthenon. The Parthenon is built after the Greek War. It is a Doric temple of post and lintels. We have a architrave. We have, around the architrave, we have triglyphs. We have metopes and pictorial panels. And then we would have a thatched roof. This was the treasury for the Delian League and named after Athena, Athens, the namesake of Athens. This would have been built on a conical hill called the Acropolis, where there were many different temples there and could be seen throughout Athens. In the pediment, where we find great sculptures that were built by Phidias. Phidias is also the architect of the building as well, and these sculptures begin to show us like how masterful the Greeks were in creating their realistic sculpture. Inside, probably Phidias's greatest sculpture is a 30-foot tall, covered in gold sheeting image of Athena. And this sculpture has long been looted, and the gold plates are gone. Everything else has been removed after the Greeks were destroyed by the Romans, and the Ottomans and everybody else is going to get in on it. Greek music and Greek dance. So we know that music existed, and I talk about that in our shaman lecture. The earliest music is probably around a campfire, human voices, rattles, drums. We saw from Mesopotamia that we had stringed instruments like lyres. And then we also have the aulos, or the flute, this kind of double flute. And then also we know that they were playing in range of tones in scales called modes. And again, these modes are all based on Pythagoras accurately determining the numerical relationship between strings and tones in different pitches. We also know of Greek dances as well, and the dances and music would have been going on in Greek festivals. Here's a little bit of what a Greek dance might have looked like. Obviously classical Greek clothing, Greek hairstyles. Notice here another place for women in a society that is basically closed to women for the most part. And here's a little bit of the double flute instrument and what it sounds like. Sounds a little bit like a kazoo. And then the last great age to wrap this up. So the last great age is the Hellenistic age from 323 to 30 BC. So the kind of turbulent era of the 4th century, marked by rivalry and warfare, the Peloponnesian War, is ultimately going to lead to the rise of the Macedonians from the north. Philip of Macedonia will defeat the Greeks in 338 BC. He will be assassinated, and his 20-year-old son Alexander, who lives from 356 to 323 BC, will assume the Macedonian throne. He is a student of Aristotle. He understands Greek philosophy, and within 12 years, he is going to stretch the Macedonian Empire to the Greek Empire, to Asia Minor, to Persia, to India, and to northern Egypt, and create the city after his name. And from him, we get that last great age of Hellenization. So from Hellenization, we get this spreading of Greek culture across the world, and we get a new kind of Greek sculpture. The classical Greek sculptures that we had looked at here were all standing still. They were not in motion. There was no emotion in their face. When we get to the Hellenistic sculptures, notice the opposite is true. In the Laquan group here, which is about a Trojan priest, Laquan, who is ultimately going to want to defeat the Greeks by telling the Trojan generals that this Trojan horse, you should not let this tribute into the city because it will destroy the city. And ultimately, the priest and his sons are going to be killed when the god of the sea, and Neptune is going to bring these serpents in, and they're going to kill them, him and his sons. And we see that action happening here. This is in action; it is not still. The figures are elongated rather than perfectly mathematical. Now, we don't see any individuality, they're still idealized, but we see a range of human emotions here as they are struggling unsuccessfully for their life. So in Hellenistic sculpture, emotion and also movement. And the final thing that I want to leave you with is the conflux of culture in Alexandria, where in this coffin here of Artemendoros, we find a mummified body that has the Egyptian forms of burial. We see Egyptian gods and symbols here, but then we see a death portrait that is very Roman in terms of, the Greeks don't do this, the Romans do these death portraits that are idealized of what the younger person in the coffin might have looked like. And we also know that he has a Greek name. So we're seeing here in northern Egypt, Roman, Greek, and Egyptian culture all coming together. Okay, so you'll do your reading. Again, make sure that you're reading, that the assessment, that you are writing completely all parts of the answer from our textbook. And I would also like you, for our discussion, to watch this about 8-minute video narrated by the great American filmmaker Orson Welles. The animation is drawn by Dick Oden, who started the illustration program at CSU Long Beach. And I think it's a very good cartoon, but it also, I think, has some really nice points about Plato's philosophic inquiry. What do you personally accept as true? What do you question? How do you know what you know? And I would like you, after watching this, to kind of begin to answer these questions yourself. Okay, so that's it today for the Greeks. Our next lecture will be on the Romans. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.